Hi, I'm Julie Lubinsky. I'm the Associate Director of Digital for the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's live webinar with Terry Gupta. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Terry. Terry Gupta believes that we are here to love and serve, and she serves now as a consultant wellness specialist and as the co-founder director of Yoga Caps and co-founder of RX Relax. So now I'd like to turn it over to Terry. Hi, Terry.
Hi, Julie, and thank you. And welcome everyone to today's webinar on the art of managing anxiety and worry. Glad you could join us. And we'll begin just with a note that today we will be talking about obviously anxiety and worry, having some discussion around it, maybe even some examples. So if at any time you feel any discomfort, please give yourself permission to stop watching and do something that feels safe and comfortable for you. I'm going to present as many strategies as possible in our time allowed, and future webinars in this series may also provide some support, so we'll talk about those a little bit later. Our content today is not intended to replace medical care or counseling, and if you are seeing a behavioral health professional, I advise you to consult with them before applying any of the content. You want to make sure that the path that you're on with your counselor is congruent with any of the strategies today. So what we're going to be doing today is starting with some basic education about worry and how it contributes to anxiety, and a little bit about how it's processed in the brain. Our overall aim is to understand and reduce discomfort related to anxiety and worry. And we'll do that by discussing some brain-based strategies, some problem-solving skills that can help us observe, assess, manage worry, and manage anxiety. So we all know what worry feels like, right? It's part of the human condition. Our anxieties may come from things that happened in the past, experiences we had in the past, what's happening now, or what could happen, the what-ifs that could happen in the future. So some worry or anxiety most likely existed prior to our experiences related to paralysis. As we know, life with paralysis brings cascades of what-if scenarios, and all of these have the potential to have an impact on us and on the quality of our life experience. So I'd like to start with a couple of questions to consider, and you can think about these throughout our time today, and then again on your own. First question is, what do you tell yourself about your worry and anxiety? Okay, what is it that you tell yourself about your experience of worry and anxiety? And we'll talk about that a little bit more on the next two slides. The second question and third question, what are your available coping resources? And what's your confidence in coping and using those resources? And that's important because a lot of times we sort of undercut our own, things that we've learned, things that we know. So whether you feel you're doing pretty well and you just tuned in to get that confirmation that you are doing well, you have a good set of resources, that's terrific. Or if you're feeling a little more challenged and you're here to pick up strategies or have you get started, that's great as well. So let's turn to that first question about what we tell ourselves about our worry and anxiety. And for those of you that are on the phone and not seeing the picture, we have a picture of a person that is sitting by themselves in a quiet room, and there's the thought here, I'm a worrier. This is just the way I am. And I'm wondering if this sounds like something you think, or something you might hold down deep somewhere, something you might have even said. We all worry. We all have worrisome thoughts. But it's not who we are, and we do have the power to change it. And with the right support, we can transform worrier to warrior. Okay? And this is just the way I am. And now we have a picture of someone who is got a t-shirt on that says resilient. So the brain can change, it can update, we learn and reinforce new things. I mean, if you think about it, things we studied back in grade school or high school, maybe something like geography. Unless you are traveling a lot or unless you have a hobby, to know your state capitals, that might be something that we don't remember. It's not reinforced. So the same applies for worry and anxiety, our topics today. It takes some grit, it takes some courage to explore these areas, but it can be done, and that's what we're here to talk about and to build those skills. So let's start with the components of anxiety. Worry is one of the three main components of anxiety. So with worry, the cognitive piece of it is our repeated thoughts. These turn into embedded ideas, which are our beliefs. And then the effects of these thoughts that become felt in our body, these are the symptoms of worry and anxiety. It becomes physiological, it becomes emotional, and that's when an alert or alarm gets activated. Anxiety also has a behavioral component, and this is when our thoughts and beliefs lead to our behaviors. So interaction then between our thoughts, the images, the physical sensations, the emotions, behaviors is how our anxiety develops. And some of the signs that we experience may include restlessness or nausea, quickened heart rate, quickened respiration rate, dizziness. If our body it has sweating happening in some parts, some ruminating thoughts, feeling of dread, and many more. I mean, we all may have our own signs of anxiety. There are plenty more, that's for sure. Assuming there's no imminent safety risk, we can make observations and notes about these. We can share these with our physician to help assess the experience. And our physical and mental health are intertwined, so we do want to really check with our physician. Symptoms that look like anxiety may be related to co-occurring medical conditions. This might be something to do with our heart, with chronic pain, with the thyroid, or even some of the physical realities related to spinal cord injury. And I had written about this in one of the blogs on the Reeve Foundation website, dealing with how to ease anxiety for individuals living with paralysis. So you can maybe check that blog if you haven't to pick up some of that information. So anxiety can also be a side effect of some medications. So there are certain headache medications that contain caffeine, some of the corticosteroids that treat pain, bronchitis, allergic reactions, asthma, also medications for seizures, thyroid issues, weight loss, Parkinson's. So it's really a good thing to think about checking with your doctor and your pharmacist. So where is this anxiety coming from? Anxiety then presents as mild, occasional anxiety. It can be more moderate, or it can become more severe or even extremely severe. And with an anxiety condition, this is the case. The fear and the worry is prolonged. There are many many types of anxiety conditions, and I'll refer you again to the Reeve Foundation website to look for some of Nurse Linda's blogs on mental health. She's written a lot about that, and you can see a longer list. But if we were going to condense it for our purposes today, there's a generalized anxiety that includes a lot of different categories, things that we worry about, phobia-related or fear-related, panic disorder, and this one tends to be the most intense. Another thing to think about is excessive worry can put us at risk of a depression disorder, or it might add to it. These are often considered to be two sides of the same coin. So it's important, if you have multiple episodes of panic, suicidal thoughts, if the anxiety is interfering with daily life or the initiation of tasks or completion of tasks, or if you have any trouble sleeping on a more long-term basis, or having feelings of depression, that really to seek some professional support. I mean, we can seek professional support anytime, but particularly if some of these things are happening for you. So types of professional support, there are so many modalities. I don't have this on the screen, but again, it's in that one blog. for easing anxiety. And it might include cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, somatic experiencing, positive psychology. I mean, there are a number of therapies, including the more emerging compassion therapies. There are options for one-on-one care with private practitioners. These can be in person or even online. There might be more accessible care in community health centers. There can be group therapy. There can be clinician-led support groups. So, there are lots of different options, and you can research more about these online. Another type of professional support would be that an anxiety disorder can also be treated with a medication, especially in the acute phases. In general, it's a good idea to learn about all the medicines you take, including vitamins, supplements, and herbal remedies, because these have interaction with other medications. And the Reeve Foundation has an Understand Your Medication series that's presented by a pharmacist. With regard to medications for anxiety, you want to think about this. Before starting, what are the potential side effects, the adverse effects, and also before stopping them. So some of the medicines, like some of the benzodiazepines, require some medical oversight and also some especially around the tapering, to discontinue. So check with your own pharmacist for more information about that. Important to note that medicines help manage the symptoms of anxiety, and that's what we call on them for, and they can do that. However, they don't cure anxiety, and they don't rewire the brain circuitry. So let's take a look a little bit about the brain. So we're going to simplify it a little bit. Some of you may be quite knowledgeable about this. Some of you this may be some new information. And when it comes to the brain, there's always some new information. It's really a fascinating frontier. So let's look at three parts of the brain: the amygdala, the cortex, and the thalamus. So the amygdala is our alert center. The cortex is our logic or thinking center. The thalamus sends sensory data to the amygdala and the cortex at the same time. However, it arrives at the amygdala faster than the cortex. You see the green arrow there from thalamus to amygdala. The cortex also receives the information kind of quickly, but it's a little bit slower than receiving it at the amygdala because it needs to process the signals. It needs to get to the right area for sight, for hearing. It needs to really think about it. And this is why we tend to react faster than we think. So the amygdala sees something, and it might say, oh no, this is a snake. And then if you can hang in there and tolerate that discomfort, the cortex might say, it's a rope, it's not a snake, or it's a stick, it's not a snake. So the amygdala has many connections to the cortex, but the cortex also sends signals to the amygdala. If we take it a little further on our broad brushstroke, we can see that the amygdala responds fast to perceived threat. It takes over. This is where we have fight, flight, and freeze responses. The cortex is also fast, but not quite as quick as the amygdala because it's processing the details. The amygdala provides the fuel for anxiety. The amygdala feels. We feel fear before the cortex can think to understand it. The cortex can also generate the kindling for anxiety. So our thoughts and our images can trigger or activate the amygdala that carries out the response. The amygdala watches what the cortex is thinking, and it learns from experience. It creates pairings. It's pairing up that stick or that rope with the snake. The cortex learns from education and information. And that's what we learn and what we think about more. What's true about the amygdala is that false alarms are created by some of the pairings, as in our example. And we also have our avoidance behaviors. So if I'm pairing that stick or that rope with the snake, I may avoid that area completely. Okay? What's also true about the amygdala is we don't want to turn this feeling off. That, the feeling that something is wrong. It's part of our inbuilt mechanism. And if we think about what's true about the cortex, this can be the pathway for things like worry, pessimism, catastrophizing, guilt, shame, obsessing and the compulsions that go with it, perfectionism, post-traumatic stress. What's also true is with training and support, we can watch this process happening, and we can train it to recognize the pairings that are created by the amygdala, to assess the perceived danger and likeliness to happen, and then this gets wired here and in the amygdala too. So we can train the amygdala how to reduce the activation. Avoiding it doesn't make it go away. We have to do something to reset it. And it needs experience to learn. So things like seated therapeutic yoga or mat-based yoga, exercise, sleep, exposure, these are all ways we can train to reduce the activation if it's a false alarm. So the amygdala is not bad. It alerts us. It includes some of the positive associations too, like the feeling of love or affiliation. So again, we can't change the event, but we can rewire the circuitry involved in our interpretation and response. In other words, we can talk to our cortex. And a quick example here might be, some of you may have seen the movie The Aviator. And this is the story of Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes had the experience of obsessive compulsive disorder. And the actor that played him in the movie was Leonardo DiCaprio. Now it's said that Leonardo, as a younger person, experienced some mild OCD symptoms while he was growing up. And he was able to, with some support, reduce this. But in playing the character, you know, the memorization, the prep, the rehearsals, everything that went along with that, after the movie was over, he retained some of the obsessions and compulsions. So it's said that he worked with a professional to reduce this again, and it was successful, and it's said that a lot of these techniques were borrowed from mindfulness. So just gives a quick example of how we can talk to our cortex. And that comes from our awareness. So this next section, we're going to talk about being aware of and managing our thoughts, because this is a big way that the worry comes. And we're going to use a 4-step framework for regulating worry and anxiety to be aware of where we are in the process. So that framework, I'm going to give you all the steps right now: identifying, resisting, accepting, and managing. And then we'll talk about each one a little bit more. So you can see right away these are verbs, not nouns, and I put them that way on purpose. I could have said identify, resist, accept, but we want to make it a verb to indicate that it's an ongoing process, an ongoing action. Okay, we never have completely identified. We always may have a little bit of resistance. You know, with new situations that crop up. So really, it's an ongoing part, and it's not linear, right? We may jump back and forth between these phases, but I will present it in a linear way. So let's start with our thoughts. As we said, our thoughts really are shaping so much of our experience. And the first thing we can do is really start to name our thoughts. It's said that we have so many thoughts, we're not aware of them. Some of them come from places that are not completely conscious in our conscious awareness for us. So if we can get in the habit of naming these thoughts, particularly the thoughts that create worry, it decaffects the emotion. And it also gives us the power of choice. And speaking them out loud can further decaffect and, importantly, move us to coping and problem solving versus the worry cycle. So an example here might be, I'm worried I may not learn this new routine or how to transfer or whatever it is that we are trying to do. And if we can name that, if we can speak that out loud, if we can share that with someone, we're more likely to move into coping and problem solving. If not, it may progress, and we may say, or we may be thinking, and I can't stop thinking about it, and develop a feeling of dread. So this idea of sharing where we feel vulnerable can help decaffect, it can help move us to coping and problem solving, and it can also help us build relationship with ourselves and relationship with others. Anxiety can be really isolating, so this is really something to think about, something to consider. And we can practice this by pausing throughout the day to check in with our thoughts. Our feelings and our emotions are like breadcrumbs of our thoughts. You know, if we're having a strong feeling, a strong emotion, we can look at what was I thinking about or what am I thinking about. And that way when we are under duress, we can pause and manage more effectively. So what might we be looking for? Let's focus on 3 thought management techniques to take a look at what's there. And all of these, we're looking for being in the non-judgment zone. Okay, so the first one is it a new thought or a repeat thought? And it's said that the vast majority of our thoughts are repeat thoughts. This is especially true with worry. And this reinforces the wiring, okay, those pairings. So the first thing we can do is acknowledge thoughts, which helps to decaffect the impact. Then we can consider maybe a self-reminder. Something like telling ourselves gently, kindly, that this is a repeat thought, or that I've already had this thought, or that I've already worried about this thought. So that's one of the first things we can do. Then we can look at the content, particularly of those repeat thoughts. Is it a helpful thought? Is it unhelpful? Or is it neutral? And if it is unhelpful, how can I frame it to be more helpful or at least neutral? And that reframing, does that seem believable to me? So if we looked at our example about learning a new care routine, we might say to ourselves, I'm practicing and preparing for this technique. Or I'm seeking support in the meantime. Or something like, I will get through this. And then moving on to this third and final thought management technique, we might identify if this worry thought is related to past experience, or is it a future what if? What if this happens, or what if that happens? So the thing about these what ifs is that we never, or often, we don't answer them. And if we can consider answering that what if, again, that moves us to problem solving. So remember, we had the fight, and flight, and the freeze. So we can get frozen with these what ifs, and we want to move ourselves into the problem solving. So we can get a piece of paper out and start doing the scenarios. We can work with someone on this, but really consider answering some of these what ifs. And then another way to use this technique is to think about, is there a way that I might bring it into the present moment? Okay, can I be aware that this is a thought about the past? This is something, a what if about the future? And how can I be right in the present moment? And another little story here is just a comedian I heard, very famous comedian, did an interview on National Public Radio. And he was talking about the many years he had really significant challenges with anxiety. And he noticed that the time in his life that he was the most anxiety-free was when he was doing his stand-up routine. And this is because he said he had to create in the moment. He had to be watching the audience. He had to be, the rapport that you develop. And so that was a terrific insight for him and a real breakthrough for him on getting hold of it. And if you think about it, there are lots of new comedians. Maybe you've seen some of their work, and they seem, maybe like they're a little nervous, and they're thinking that what if the audience doesn't laugh, perhaps. So our heart goes out to them, and we can send them some good thoughts, but just about staying in the present moment is that final piece for the thought management techniques. Now, on to our 4-part framework where we're using our awareness to help us regulate worry and anxiety. So we can, in our pausing, we can think about where I am in this framework. So the first piece of the framework is on identifying. Am I aware of the worry and anxiety symptoms, and what are they for me? What was I thinking or doing or feeling or seeing when I realized the symptoms? How about just before the symptoms arose? And where was I mean, physically, geographically? What room was I in? What state was I in? What, et cetera. And what seemed to help self-calm. So that whole identifying piece, we can keep a log, we can keep a journal, and see and look for the patterns and the correlations. So we'll talk more about journaling after we add some more content. Okay? Moving then and thinking about resisting a little bit. It's a normal reaction to resist something that's uncomfortable, that's unpleasant. This is where we get our avoidance behaviors. So what are yours? Have you thought about it in that way? What am I avoiding? What is my worry causing me to avoid? And an example here might be if I am, let's say I'm worried or I have a fear of germs, am I avoiding pressing elevator buttons? Or is it more social and I'm making excuses for why I can't go somewhere? So what we resist persists. Okay, it extends our anxiety, our stress response. It isolates us further. It saps our energy that we need so preciously to get our routines completed. And it creates some physical tension in the body as well. So acceptance then emerges as a choice. And can we cultivate some tolerance of our vulnerability? And by that, tolerance through some exposure to what it is that worries us. Okay? And this might be something we can do on our own. We might actually do it. We might go do a scenario in our mind where we do a visualization. Or it may be that we work with a professional. And what we're looking at here is how I'm feeling in the moment. And we're not our feelings. And we can see that the feelings rise and fall and they come and go. So if we can have some tolerance of these feelings, we can move to managing, and then we can rewire. Okay, next step that we're going to do is going to be to talk about that. And always, like we did in the beginning, giving ourselves permission to stop when if it feels uncomfortable and return to something that feels a little bit more comfortable. Okay, so the fourth part of the framework, managing. So we have two parts here. The first part, centering us in the present, so we just kind of covered that. And the strategies are going to continue to help us center in the present, and they're also going to self-calm to help support the rewiring of our inner scripts. So again, building our tolerance. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is our posture. And right away, when I say the word posture, some of you may have quickly adjusted your posture a little bit. And that's natural. We all need reminders to correct our posture, especially in all the technology we use and the texting and things like that. Anxiety, paralysis, and caregiving all have an impact on our posture. Among other effects, we may have shoulders that slouch forward, the head position may fall forward a little bit, the center of balance may feel like it's shifted, and it has shifted. So these can influence our physiology, things like our respiration rate. They can influence our emotional state to reinforce the anxiety. And then they're reinforced by the soft tissue, the fascia, the connective tissue rather, in the muscles kind of get frozen a little bit. So it gets harder and harder to self-correct the posture. So there's plenty of resources there for us to learn how to correct our posture. So that's something that I recommend that we do. And if you use a wheelchair and you haven't already done so, please get some posture advice as well as some exercises from your healthcare team to build seated postural control. And maybe a reminder to check cushions for weight distribution as well as the need for support devices. So posture is the first way that we can shift or reframe the experience of anxiety as an emotion and as a physical way of collecting tension in our body. So closely connected with this, we can shift or reframe with breath-based techniques. So the breath may become higher in the trunk, it may become faster, and it may become more shallow, again with anxiety, with paralysis, and with being a carer. So breathing practices, without going into the mechanism of action, can reduce anxiety and create the chemical conditions for the cortex to rewire. And I know we have a range of listeners today, so we're going to go through a list, and I'll ask you to select what's most accessible to you. The first one is observing natural breath. And whatever your natural breath is, whatever way you breathe, that is your natural breath, and rather than changing it. So no manipulation here. And if we think about a breath, it's got a couple of aspects to it, right? If we were to dissect a breath, it would have an inhalation, it would have an exhalation, and then there would be some transition between the two phases, maybe a slight pause before and after. So how you might do that is take a pause, and whatever the length of the inhale, you might mentally repeat to yourself, inhaling, 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 and then mentally you say slight pause, and then on the exhale, exhaling, 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 and then you say slight pause. So this is one way we focus our attention on something tangible. This is part of mindfulness, and you are self-coaching yourself. So you could do this just on its own, or you could add observing some sensation, and it may be just a regular sensation in the body, maybe the air on your nose tip or your forehead, or it may be some discomfort sensation, emotional discomfort, or it may be other physical sensation. And you can also use it to tolerate worrisome thought. Okay, so you can pair them up, you can stack them. The next thing we can do with our breath is some manipulation. So the first one, we're not doing any manipulation. And the second one, if you can access manipulation of the breath, you can do deepening, or what I call stretching the breath. Okay, so when we do that, we are building our muscles, which is helpful anyway, and we are getting the deeper breath, which can help reduce anxiety. Now, a lot of people read about, I can lengthen my exhale to reduce anxiety, and that's true. Chemically, what happens in the body, a lengthened exhale can help us reduce anxiety and manage the symptoms. However, if it's advisable to not jump from just the natural breath to lengthen the exhale. We don't want to tax the muscles. We don't want to tax the breath. It's good to practice the deepening or the stretching before you go right to lengthening. Okay? So you might say, well, gee, this is great, but when I'm anxious, I'm probably not going to really be able to do this kind of breathing. So this is two things about that. So that's why we practice ahead of time, so that when we need it, we can access it. And then the other thing that I've used very successfully in groups and one-on-ones with folks is what I call verbal toning. So this is the almost singing of a syllable like ah, or or la, or oh. And this is done at whatever volume. It's done with whatever effort. Not a big effort is needed. It naturally lengthens the exhale. And I've used this. I'll tell you about one time I used this that was very effective. If we just take a moment and remember the Boston Marathon bombing, and we send our love and our feelings of peace around that. I was getting ready to teach a group or work with a group at a hospital, and by the time I had arrived there, the news had come out, and the group members were concerned. They were worried. Experiencing angst was one woman in particular who had not gotten onto one of the planes that crashed during 9/11. And to add more to that, one of the group members was at the marathon. Her husband was running, so she was there. We didn't know where she was, and she's pregnant at the time. So the group was definitely in need for something to help reduce anxiety, to manage this worry, to manage this catastrophe. So we did. We don't have time to do the whole practice, but we did the verbal toning routine that I have, and by the end there was peace, there was ease, there was. We felt like we had done something to create some vibration of containment, and we were able to get on with the group. And as it turns out, our person in the group was fine. She was not at the finish line. And again, we send our feelings of love and peace to everybody who was involved with that. But a powerful situation to show that these things do work. Okay. Another thing with the breath we can use is diaphragmatic breath if we can access that type of breathing. And with fight or flight, these deeper breaths, these diaphragmatic breaths can really help self-calm. With spinal cord injury, please talk to your healthcare team about topics like the best ways to strengthen whatever the breathing muscles are that you're using. The best ways to preserve the diaphragm, to pace the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a muscle that weakens quickly if we don't use it. And if we can aim to understand mechanical ventilation settings, and again, this is another reason to wean from mechanical ventilation when it's possible. So with the freeze response, we talked about fight and flight. With the freeze response, we can use an energizing breath. Okay, so these other breaths are relaxing breaths. With the freeze response, we want to use shorter breaths as opposed to deeper breaths to energize. So these breathing practices are part of the body of contemplative practices. So these are coming from yoga, so seated therapeutic yoga, mat-based yoga, other contemplative practices like Tai Chi, Qigong in particular, which can be done seated, or Tai Chi, which can be done standing, other practices that feel focused and calming. Okay, these are the components. And in my practice, I feel that seated therapeutic yoga is really one of the best because it includes all of the strategies about that we talked about today, or we will talk about, and more. So there's some movement, whether that is physical or whether it's assisted and passive. Movement can be mentally done with visualization, with mental rehearsal, and this can help release held tension and also help the repatterning of the cortex. There's progressive relaxation, many, many more breath techniques than we just talked about. There's mindfulness and meditation, which are a part of yoga, and this has room for and includes exposure-related techniques, and intention, which we'll discuss shortly. So in this category, you can attend a class, you can use a DVD to work at home, and the recommendation is to work with your own experience, which changes every time you approach the practice, right? And build your capacity. Always be where you are instead of pushing or forcing. And I really recommend here a yoga therapist who's also a healthcare professional, and this ensures experience with yoga, with anxiety, and with contemplative practices. You know, safety is a concern with all the things that we are going to be talking about. And as well as the contemplative practices, we can also do seated exercise or other activity or exercise that is done in a standing position. So this can be aerobic, it can be wheelchair dancing. Again, things that involve the focus and the patterns of movement. So when we do repeated parts of a routine, like an exercise routine or a dancing routine, again, this is another way that we can rewire the circuitry in the brain. So in this case, you can ask a physical therapist for help or an experienced instructor. And that instructor might be someone in the gym, or it might be somebody that's found an adaptive sports program or a therapeutic recreation program. And you may know that most counties, at least in the United States, have therapeutic recreation specialists. And you can, if you would like one, request a one-on-one with these folks. And they can help come up with a nice exercise routine as well. And there are also some really wonderful peer-led exercise programs out there. One that I know of in particular and have some experience with is called WHIM, Wheelchair Health in Motion. They're based out of New Hampshire. So these classes, or you can attend in person. Again, you can use a DVD if there's an app that you feel is reputable. And if you need help either with the yoga, the contemplative practices, or the seated exercise or other activities, finding a program or a class, you can also contact the Reeve information specialists to help you locate a resource. So another way that we can calm the physical symptoms of anxiety is with self-compassion. This is a really, I've really been talking about this for a long time, but from a research perspective, this is what's happening right now, is the research around self-compassion. It really builds our capacity to hold our vulnerability. And this is important when it comes to anxiety, when it comes to worry. Question we can ask ourselves is, how do I care for myself when I'm having worrisome thoughts? So how do I care for myself in that case? And that right away can help us generate our own strategies. But one in particular that I use a lot are self-hugs. These balance the nervous system, they release endorphins, and we include them in almost every group that we do in some form or fashion. I mean, it's also a really it can be a really nice stretch for the arms and shoulders, and the neck gets in there a little bit as well. And just a quick story here, we're doing a group at the VA hospital, and we have one group member there who was very excited about the group. I mean, he'd be rolling around telling everybody, hey, it's time, come on in the room. But he'd be a little uncomfortable about the self-hug part, right? And so what he started to do was when he would do his hug, he would start to kiss. He'd kiss his hands, he'd kiss up one arm, he'd kiss down that arm, and he'd kiss, so he's kissing right into his hug. And so he made it kind of humorous, and that sort of broke the ice for everybody. I mean, all of these veterans then they felt a little bit more able to do that self-hug. So whatever works, for folks. And the self-hug can be a really nice technique there. And you can actually stack the technique with the breathing. You can do the self-hug and then breathe into, it's almost like breathing into your own embrace, right? So the next thing that in practicing self-compassion is awareness of our self-talk. And in this case, what we think and what we say out loud can increase the anxiety. But we have a choice over using words that command versus words that provide us the choice. So when we feel commanded, we may feel like we've got less options, less control, and it increases the worry possibly. So we already talked a little bit about nouns versus verbs. The word relax itself is a command word if we think about it, and it can be a potential trigger, particularly with anxiety. So if we can think about it as relaxing, is this a more believable continuum that acknowledges the anxiety but still allows us to have the action of that word? And another pairing of words might be, instead of saying need or thinking need, choosing or considering. Okay? We also can notice the influence of words if we think or speak in extremes. Words like always or never versus occasionally. So if we were to be thinking or saying this technique, this is never going to work, this anxiety technique, versus let me see if this can be helpful today. So that's something to think about. And it's an art. Actually, if we come back to that, our words are an art and a gift to ourselves and our others and the people in our circle, right? It's a given that we are going to slip and use a word that maybe is not as helpful, or think a word that's not as helpful, and this is where we use our self-compassion, and we just reframe it. So building on that, we will move from self-talk into an actual intention phrase. So creating this intention or resolve is a short phrase that can be repeated. And we can repeat it regularly on waking up, at midday, before bed. We can use it during our contemplative practices or exercise. We can do our intention before we start and then when we're finishing. And anytime it might be helpful, okay, particularly when we're feeling challenged. So an example here might be, I'm a resilient being. So we flashed that on the screen and we talked about that earlier in the PowerPoint. Did you believe it, or do you believe that about yourself? And if some part of you questions that a little bit, how about, I am building my resilience? And guess what? That's true, because in this moment you are. You're here on this webinar and you're learning something or having something you already know be reinforced, so you are building your resilience. And another example might be, I am learning too, and answers to that might be care for my body, or advocate for myself, or build courage every day. So the key parts of these phrases are that the focus is helpful or neutral and in the present. Okay, I am building my resilience right now. It's believable that we keep working with that phrase until it sounds right, until it feels right for us. And then the mental repetition and the rehearsal engages the senses and the positive feelings. So we imagine hearing ourselves speaking it. We imagine what it feels like, and that adds more power to it. And practically, it's short so that you can remember it. Okay, so we can use the intention phrase. And that brings us to shifting or reframing anxiety with emotional support. And here we have a phrase, an intention phrase, I am not alone. I am connected with others who also have this experience. And that is also, I think, true just about no matter what, because we might be alone with no one else in the room. We might be alone with maybe not having a big circle, or maybe we don't have any circle. But we are connected with others actually across the globe who have had this experience and who have this experience. Maybe not the exact experiences that we're having, because our lives are unique, but there are some common elements, and the experience of worry is as we said, part of the human condition. So reframing with emotional support is a little bit different than some of the behavioral strategies we've talked about. This gets at some of the affiliative need and the affiliative connection, depending on what our affiliative connections were in our early years. This may be an area that can cause us some anxiety, all right? And we'll talk about that more in our webinar on the mental health for caregivers. Actually, we're all caregivers, so caregivers of ourselves, so everyone hopefully will have some interest in that. So it might include spending time with friends and loved ones. It certainly includes our support animals who are trained to understand anxiety. It might include eye contact with someone you trust. And think about that. Think about eye contact. Think about how it helps us make connection and how it can hold distress together. And that's if it feels comfortable to you, if it feels appropriate to you. And it might be a gaze that's held between a parent and a child, or between two partners or two friends. So this is a soft, supportive gaze. And what this does for us can be, again, very powerful and can shift things quickly. And the soft, supportive gaze as opposed to a hard stare. Okay, it's not who can blink, who can delay blinking. Remember the game that we played perhaps as kids. It's not that kind of a game. It's a soft, supportive gaze. Emotional support also includes a counselor and other carers. It includes peer mentors. The Reeve Foundation has a wonderful team of peer mentors that you can look into, either being one or being connected with one. And that peer support from people that have similar experiences to us can be really, really valuable. If you haven't checked Reeve Connect, this is online support. So wherever you are, you can join in. And you can talk about just about anything. There are some categories there. You see them if you have a screen. If you are calling in from your phone, there's a category for newly paralyzed, for new normal, for health and wellness, for relationships. So you see just above that, the header there, it says, discover how others conquer all aspects of life. So again, the belief of being a worrier, transitioning to the belief of being a warrior with grit, with courage. So check out Reeve Connect. So we can shift or reframe with more problem-solving strategies. There are so many of them. Having a counselor can really even generate more, or doing some more reading. But just a couple other quick things as we start to come to a close. We can choose actually to do something. So one of the strategies maybe that are here, or maybe a strategy that you use that hasn't been mentioned here. We can choose to do nothing, and that's our choice. We can choose to do something later, or if it's needed, okay? And we can do something later, like a worry session, if we wanted. This is a 5 or 10 minute period. It's time limited. It's a short amount of time, and it's like putting your worries in a box, okay? So let's say you're having some of those repeat behaviors. You've tried identifying them. You've tried managing them in some way, and you've tried breathing through them. And another thing that you can do is say, I'll think about that in my worry session later. And maybe later comes and you're involved with something else, and that's fine. Okay, if you miss that worry session, then that's another way to manage it. Okay, we talked earlier about the journaling. And I want to add here a little bit more now because we've covered a lot more content. So journaling, and particularly with images, can be really a terrific way to express ourselves. So the images and the journaling, sometimes when we think journaling, we might think about handwriting. And handwriting, it could be, or it could be using the computer. It could be speaking and using the software that just writes it for us. And if we can have images either in our mind or images that are drawn or cut and paste, photos, computer generated, because that speaks to another part of the brain. Okay, so, and then this piece that we've created, we can periodically review it and for self-study. And again, non-judgment zone. This can help us to raise awareness of our thoughts, of the words we've been using, because there it is, I said it, or it was a thought I had, or to see the patterns more readily. We can see them emerge over the course of a couple of days, a couple of weeks, a couple of months. It may help ID triggers, and it might give insights to the sources. Okay, so all of this, really, what we're looking to do is provide a space between the act and the react to let our own wisdom come through, okay, our own inherent wisdom, and that is the insight to what's really behind all of this, okay? Things get, the way that our brains capture things, everything's connected to something, okay? So we say to ourselves, when did you worry about that, and the time before that, and the time before that, and what was similar the time before that? So journaling can help with that. And all along the way, what are the strategies that seem most helpful? So additional support, we mentioned, the two-part blog about anxiety that we've had. We have 2 more webinars coming up, the Mental Health and Self-Care for Caregivers, December 12th, 2019 at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then another one that I think we'll talk about anxiety. We'll talk about anxiety in both of them, but the mindfulness one to support life after paralysis, January 8th, 2020 at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So these are all free, just as the one is today. They will be taped, but you have to register for them. Actually, no, because they will be on the YouTube channel, so I take that back. So additional support there, and the additional reading. You can get workbooks. I mean, there's all kinds of materials that are also out there. So as we start to bring some closure, I'd like to give us some summary thoughts. Today we worked on our awareness through education and observation. We talked about the importance of deepening our awareness. And what are we being aware of? Well, our biology, our brain, and how our body is processing all of these thoughts. We talked about awareness of our thoughts, of our actions, and our inactions through our avoidance behaviors, and all of the techniques that are available. Okay. We talked about working with techniques that you find helpful or that you feel called to practice or try. And these techniques had two features about them. One was it's a technique that can help us either self-calm or energize and promote the updating of our inner scripts, and a technique that can help us center ourselves into the present moment. Okay, so this self-regulation gives us that power and that control. And the third summary bullet is consider what combinations of support, whether self, social, professional, seem right to you. So what's the mix that's right for you? And again, that changes and shifts. So in the beginning, we asked ourselves these three questions, and I'd like to just quickly revisit them again. So what do we tell ourselves about our anxiety? So hopefully you are thinking a little bit more about the word worrier and transforming it to warrior with some resilience. And this is just the way I am, or just the way I am becoming. And what are your available coping resources and your confidence in coping? Well, maybe it's reinforced that you've already got a pretty good set of techniques you're using. Or maybe you have learned some things, and with practice you'll develop more confidence. So 3 things to think about, and I'll leave you with a parting thought before we look for any questions. So this webinar and all of the resources at the Reeve Foundation are holding a caring space for you. So thank you so much for your tuning in. And let's see, we have a couple of minutes here if we have some questions. And I am not seeing questions. Julie, is it a technological issue, or is it in fact that there aren't questions?
I just want to remind all participants that you can ask questions using the chat box. So if you want to, we'll wait a minute, and then you can type in your questions. If there are none, we'll move on. This is being recorded, and we will post this in we'll send down an email after it's archived and available for you to view, and then we will provide that link to you via email that you registered with.
Oh, actually, I do see a couple of questions in the other box. So somebody said, can they have, where will they find this? Julie, I think you just answered that. And is there a copy to review it? I think, as Julie said, it'll be on the Reeve Foundation's YouTube site. And somebody asked, what is that third component of anxiety? Okay, so let's see if maybe I'll go back to it. So if you are a person who is viewing the slides as well, you can see it right on the slide. I always find that it's helpful to see. Okay, so here are 3 components of anxiety. So it starts with thoughts, a thinking, a cognitive process. So worry is a component of anxiety. And then it turns into a felt experience in our body, which can be a physiological symptom or an emotional symptom that sets off the alarm, the anxiety alarm. And then it's behavior, because we have behaviors, whether they're avoidance behaviors or whatever they are. These come from our thoughts and beliefs. So I hope that helps. Okay. Someone asks, is a CEU being offered for this webinar? Well, it's not. If that's something you'd like to see, that's maybe a thought for the Reeve Foundation. Okay. I think that is our questions, and it looks like it's 3 o'clock. So, Julie, do you want to wait to see if there are more questions, or are we okay?
I saw that we got a comment in the Q&A tab.
Here is another question. Oh, go ahead, yeah?
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, someone asked if the cause of anxiety and depression is trauma. Is this information helpful? Yes, it can be, because a lot of the, remember we talked about the cortex as a pathway for PTSD, so without getting too technical, the answer would be yes. And a lot of the things that we talked about, the seated yoga or mat-based yoga, the exercise, things that give us the power to self-regulate, things that help us to repattern. So when we're doing repeated movements like we would with exercise, with movement, with dance routines, all of these things will help us with PTSD. Okay. But you can study a little bit more about trauma as well. But yes, some of this definitely applies. Great. Well, thank you for some of the feedback we're receiving, and I'll check one more time for the question box. And I think that's it.
Great, thank you. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And again, look for an email with the link to view this presentation on our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Terry.
Thank you, and thank you, everybody. Take good care now.
That will conclude today's webinar. Thank you for your participation.